This is the unknown zone, where the secrets of history breathe once more. Tonight, we open the door to one of the darkest and most hidden chapters of World War II, a place where science was twisted into horror, and humanity itself was dissected in the name of empire. This is the story Japan tried to erase, the story of Unit 731. The year was 1937. War had erupted in Asia. Japan, driven by expansion and ideology, invaded China under the banner of creating a new empire, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To most, it looked like another colonial conquest. But behind the battlefields, something far more sinister was unfolding. Hidden deep in the cold plains of Manchuria, near the city of Harbin, Japan began constructing a facility unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its official name was the Epidemic, Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To outsiders, it sounded like a medical research station, a place to study disease and improve sanitation for troops. In reality, it was the front for the most secret and horrific human experimentation program of the war. Its true name was Unit 731. The mastermind behind it was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious, and deeply nationalistic military doctor. He believed biological weapons could become the ultimate tool of war, capable of wiping out cities without a single bullet fired. To him, disease was the perfect soldier, invisible, unstoppable, and cheap. Ishii convinced the Japanese High Command that with enough research, Japan could harness the power of bacteria and viruses as weapons of mass destruction. He promised victory through science, and in return, he was given unlimited power, funding, and secrecy. The facility that rose under his command became a fortress of death disguised as a hospital. Behind its concrete walls were laboratories, surgical theaters, barracks, and crematoriums. Hundreds of scientists, doctors, and soldiers worked there in silence, sworn to secrecy. No one outside was allowed to know what happened within, and what happened inside would remain one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. At first, Ishii's program focused on basic bacteriological research, cultivating strains of plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhus. But quickly it escalated beyond anything resembling science. The Japanese military needed results. They needed to test, and to test, they needed subjects. They called them maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs. It was a cruel code name, designed to dehumanize the victims and mask the truth even from those who spoke about it. The logs were not pieces of wood. They were men, women, and children. Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Mongolians, Russians, and even captured Allied soldiers. Inside Unit 731, these people became tools, living instruments of experimentation. Every morning, trains arrived from occupied territories carrying new logs. They were taken through gates marked with military insignia and slogans about loyalty and honor. Guards stripped them of their clothes, their names, and their humanity. No records of identity were kept. Each became a number, destined for a different fate. Some were used for disease testing. Others were deliberately infected with plague or cholera to study the progression of illness. Many were vivisected, dissected alive, so that researchers could observe how infection spread inside the human body in real time. Anesthesia was rarely used. The doctors believed it would interfere with their data. Outside, smoke rose constantly from the crematorium. Inside, Ishii and his team collected samples, charted results, and logged every detail with clinical precision. To them, it was not murder. It was research, a path to Japan's dominance through biological warfare. The scale of the operation grew rapidly. By 1940, Unit 731 covered more than 6 square kilometers. It had over 150 buildings and employed more than 3,000 personnel, doctors, chemists, engineers, and soldiers. It was a self-contained city of science and death. Within its perimeter stood laboratories where bacteria were cultured by the tons. There were experimental fields for testing bombs filled with fleas carrying plague. There were frostbite chambers where prisoners were exposed to sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze solid. There were pressure chambers where bodies were crushed until their eyes burst. And there were surgery theaters where organs were removed one by one for observation. Each experiment had a purpose. Each horror was justified by data. General Ishii was obsessed with results. He reported directly to the Imperial General Staff and enjoyed personal protection from the Emperor's administration. His work was classified at the highest level, known only to a handful of officials. He believed he was serving Japan's future, building weapons that would end wars forever. But his vision extended far beyond Manchuria. He dreamed of using biological weapons against China's major cities, Nanjing, Shanghai, Chongqing, and even against the Allied powers. To test these weapons, the Japanese army began conducting live field trials. In 1940, Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over the Chinese city of Ningbo. Within days, hundreds fell ill. Soon after, cholera and typhoid attacks followed in Zhejiang province. Entire villages vanished from maps, erased not by bombs, but by invisible pathogens. Ishii called it success. His superiors called it progress. But it was genocide disguised as science. Meanwhile, within the facility, new horrors continued. Researchers performed blood transfusions between humans and animals. They tested grenades, flamethrowers, and biological bombs on live prisoners. They exposed victims to lethal doses of chemical agents and radiation. Some were forced into extreme endurance trials, starvation, dehydration, high-altitude simulation, all documented with meticulous detail. Everything was done under the name of data collection. Every death was recorded not as murder, but as a result. And yet the secrecy was almost perfect. The local population only knew the base as a mysterious military zone. Anyone who approached too closely disappeared. Workers who tried to escape were executed. Even the guards were kept ignorant of the full truth, told only that they were protecting vital national research. By 1942, Japan's war machine had expanded across the Pacific. But Ishii's work remained focused on one goal: perfecting biological warfare. He designed special porcelain bombs that could scatter plague-infected fleas across enemy territory. His tests showed that entire towns could be infected within hours. He proposed using these weapons against Allied troops in Burma, the Philippines, and even the US West Coast. The plans were never executed, not because of conscience, but because Japan's high command feared Allied retaliation in kind. Still, experiments continued. More prisoners arrived. More lives ended in silence. Unit 731 had become the hidden core of Japan's wartime science, a place where medicine and murder became indistinguishable. And as the war dragged on, its creators began to believe they were untouchable. But the tide was turning. By 1944, Japan was losing ground on every front. The Allied advance in the Pacific was unstoppable, and American bombers had begun striking the home islands. The empire that once dreamed of eternal glory was now fighting for survival. Within the walls of Unit 731, panic began to spread. Shiro Ishii knew that if the Soviets or Americans ever discovered what they had done, the truth would destroy them all. He ordered the destruction of records and the elimination of all logs. The prisoners who remained alive, thousands, were executed to erase the evidence. The crematoriums burned day and night. The compound filled with smoke once again, not of progress, but of guilt. By August 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender, Ishii ordered the total destruction of Unit 731. Buildings were blown up, files were burned. Every trace of their crimes was buried beneath the ashes of war. But secrets this dark never stay buried forever, because what happened next, after the war ended, was even more disturbing than the experiments themselves. August 1945, World War II was over. Japan had surrendered. The empire that once promised 1,000 years of glory now lay in ashes, its cities burned, its army broken, its emperor silent. Across the ruins, Allied soldiers searched for survivors and for secrets. In the north, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, sweeping through Japanese strongholds with overwhelming force. Among them was a remote facility near Harbin, a site the Japanese had tried to erase. The Soviets found nothing but wreckage, walls torn apart by explosives, rooms blackened by fire, empty cages, broken glass, and scattered medical instruments. But the smell of death still lingered in the air. They didn't yet know its name, but soon the world would. Unit 731. When the Soviets entered the compound, they found fragments, laboratory equipment, animal carcasses, scattered documents written in code. What they couldn't find were the people responsible. Shiro Ishii and his staff had fled days before the invasion, leaving behind a graveyard disguised as a hospital. Witnesses from nearby villages told stories that chilled even battle-hardened soldiers. Trains arriving at night, guards killing prisoners before retreating, smoke that never stopped rising. As Soviet investigators pieced together the evidence, they realized they had uncovered something far beyond the normal horrors of war. This was not just a military base. It was a factory of human experimentation. Inside the ruins, they discovered preserved organs in jars, bones, some marked with numbers, dissecting tables bolted to the floor, and hundreds of photographs showing medical experiments performed on living subjects. It was a glimpse into a level of cruelty the world had never imagined. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, American intelligence officers had begun their own search. Their mission was simple: identify and capture Japan's top scientists. At first, they were focused on nuclear and chemical research, but soon, reports began surfacing about biological experiments conducted in Manchuria. The information came from interrogations of Japanese soldiers who had escaped north. They spoke of a secret unit that worked with plague, anthrax, and cholera. They mentioned Shiro Ishii by name. American analysts were intrigued and alarmed. Biological warfare was a new frontier, one the US military barely understood. If Japan had advanced that far, they needed to know how. And more importantly, what data they had gathered. So began one of the most controversial decisions in post-war history. In late 1945, American intelligence officers located Shiro Ishii. He was hiding in Japan, living under a false name. When they brought him in for questioning, he was calm, polite, almost proud. He didn't deny what he had done. He simply asked one question: what will happen to me? At first, the Americans planned to prosecute him for war crimes, just like the Nazi doctors in Europe. But Ishii made them an offer. He claimed to have irreplaceable scientific data, information on biological weapons that no other country possessed, detailed records of experiments on human beings, research that could not be duplicated. He promised to share it if he and his staff were granted immunity. The US faced a moral dilemma unlike any other. The war against Japan was over, but a new one had already begun. The Cold War. The Soviet Union was now the new enemy, racing for supremacy in every field of science, including biological warfare. To American military intelligence, Ishii's data could be invaluable. So quietly, behind closed doors, deals were made. In 1946, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, approved the arrangement. Shiro Ishii and his colleagues would not be tried. In exchange, they would hand over all of Unit 731's research. Thousands of pages of notes, diagrams, and medical data collected from human experiments. The agreement was top secret. Not even the other Allied powers were informed. While Nazi doctors faced justice at Nuremberg, their Japanese counterparts were protected. The reasoning was simple and horrifying. The data was too valuable to lose. For months, Ishii and his team cooperated with US intelligence officers. They presented charts on plague infection rates, frostbite endurance, and chemical exposure limits. They explained how diseases spread faster in different temperatures, how human resistance changed with age and race. They described the effects of extreme pressure and dehydration on the human body. It was medical information, but born entirely from atrocity. Every number, every observation had come from a life taken, yet the Americans documented it, classified it, and stored it under the codename Project X. In return, Ishii and his staff were quietly released. Most returned to civilian life. Some became professors in Japan's top universities. Others joined government research labs. A few even worked for pharmaceutical companies. Their crimes vanished into silence. The Soviets, however, were not willing to forget. In 1949, they conducted their own trials in the city of Khabarovsk. 12 former members of Unit 731 were charged with war crimes. Among them, General Otozo Yamada, commander of the Kwantung Army. The trial lasted nearly a month. The defendants confessed in detail to human experimentation, plague bomb testing, and biological attacks on civilians. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described how villages in China were wiped out by diseases dropped from Japanese planes. Doctors testified that they had performed surgeries without anesthesia. Photographs and documents confirmed everything, but the world barely noticed. Western newspapers dismissed the trials as Soviet propaganda. The US government refused to recognize them, fearing it would draw attention to its own deal with Ishii. The truth was buried under the politics of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, the story of Unit 731 had all but disappeared from public view. In Japan, it was taboo, rarely mentioned in schools or history books. Many former members lived quiet lives, respected and forgotten. Shiro Ishii himself reportedly died in 1959 of throat cancer, having never spent a single day in prison. He was never tried, never punished, never even publicly acknowledged by his government. But the data he produced, the scientific legacy of Unit 731, continued to circulate within military and medical circles in the United States. It became the foundation for several early biological warfare programs, including tests conducted in the 1950s. The victims of Unit 731 Tens of thousands of men, women, and children remained nameless, their graves unmarked, their suffering erased by the silence of diplomacy. For decades, the story slept beneath the surface of history. Japan rebuilt, America moved on. The world focused on nuclear weapons and the arms race. But the truth always has a way of resurfacing. In the 1980s, Japanese journalists began investigating rumors of wartime experiments. One name kept appearing, Shiro Ishii. They found survivors who spoke of strange military trains, of families taken away and never returning, of sicknesses that swept through their villages after Japanese planes flew overhead. Soon, historians uncovered declassified US documents that confirmed what had long been denied. The immunity deal was real. The experiments had happened, and the data, the horrific data, had been used. By the 1990s, the truth was undeniable. Unit 731 was no myth. It was history, and it was one of the darkest examples of how science, when stripped of ethics, becomes a weapon more dangerous than any bomb. But one question remained. How could thousands of educated men, doctors, scientists, scholars, commit such crimes without remorse? How could they stand in front of human suffering and call it research? The answer lies not in cruelty alone, but in ideology. They believed they were serving something greater, the emperor, the nation, the war. They were taught that the lives of their enemies meant nothing, that the ends justified any means, that obedience was the highest virtue. It was not just science that failed inside Unit 731. It was morality itself. And as the Cold War continued, the silence around those crimes became a second betrayal, one committed not by soldiers, but by nations who chose to trade justice for knowledge. For more than 30 years after the war ended, Japan refused to speak about Unit 731. It was as if the facility had never existed. Its name was erased from military records. Textbooks made no mention of it. And most citizens, even veterans, claimed to know nothing. The war had ended in atomic fire, leaving Japan shattered and humiliated. The new government under American occupation focused on rebuilding the nation, not reopening its wounds. Every discussion of wartime atrocities was politically dangerous. The public wanted peace and prosperity. The authorities wanted silence. And silence for a time worked. The world turned its gaze elsewhere, to the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, and the race for space. But beneath that silence, truth waited, buried but not forgotten. In the 1950s and 60s, a few scattered voices began to ask questions. Chinese families who had lived near Harbin spoke of missing relatives. Soviet veterans remembered the strange facility they had, found in 1945. But with Japan's archives sealed and American cooperation hidden under top-secret files, there was no proof. Every attempt to investigate ended in denial. Even in Japan itself, former members of Unit 731 lived openly. Some became professors, doctors, or researchers in prestigious institutions. They published papers, held lectures, and received honors. Their wartime past never mentioned. When survivors or foreign journalists tried to confront them, the response was always the same. There was no Unit 731. It's a communist fabrication. Nothing like that ever happened. The lie lasted for decades. Then, in the 1980s, cracks began to form. Japan was a technological superpower by then, wealthy, democratic, and proud of its post-war identity as a peaceful nation. But for the younger generation, questions about the past refused to disappear. A few brave journalists began to investigate what their parents' generation had hidden. One of them was Seiichi Morimura, an author who would change everything. In 1981, Morimura published a book titled The Devil's Gluttony. It was based on interviews with former soldiers and newly uncovered documents from China. For the first time, the public saw the name Unit 731 printed in black and white. The book described the experiments, the prisoners, the plague bombs, the vivisections. It was horrifying, but meticulously sourced, and it broke Japan's silence wide open. The reaction was explosive. Some called it treason, others called it courage. Nationalists dismissed it as communist propaganda, but survivors and historians stepped forward to confirm the truth. Former Japanese medical staff, now elderly, began to speak, some out of guilt, others out of defiance. They admitted to having worked in Harbin, handling pathogens or transporting prisoners. One recalled watching a special surgery performed on a living prisoner. Another described the experiments on frostbite, remembering the screams of those whose arms were frozen and thawed repeatedly. Their testimonies were chilling, but irrefutable. It was no longer myth. It was history. In China, the revelation reignited long-suppressed pain. Local villagers who had survived the Japanese occupation began telling their stories to foreign journalists. Elderly men and women described how planes dropped strange ceramic bombs over their towns. Bombs that shattered, releasing clouds of fleas. Days later, people began to die of plague. Whole families vanished. Entire villages were burned by Japanese soldiers to stop the spread, the same plague they had unleashed. Chinese researchers excavated the site near Harbin where Unit 731 had stood. What they found confirmed everything. Buried beneath the earth were thousands of bones, human and animal, mixed together, some with surgical marks, others with drill holes or fractures. Glass bottles labeled with bacterial strains, medical instruments, and uniforms lay scattered among the ruins. Unit 731 was real, and its ghosts had finally been unearthed. As the truth spread, international outrage grew. But so did the questions. Why had no one been punished? Why had the United States protected Shiro Ishii and his men? And why had the world chosen to forget? In 1984, American historian Sheldon Harris published Factories of Death, a groundbreaking work based on declassified U.S. military documents. It revealed the immunity deal in full detail, the names of the doctors, the dates of meetings, and the U.S. Army reports that described the data as of great value. For the first time, the cover-up was proven. Harris's research showed that American intelligence officers not only knew about the human experiments, they preserved the data, studied it, and used it for Cold War biological research. The justification was the same one Ishii had offered. The information was too valuable to destroy. The world was horrified. The survivors were furious. And the silence that had lasted for decades finally shattered. By the late 1980s, survivors of the plague bombings and families of the victims began demanding justice. They filed lawsuits in Japanese courts, asking for official acknowledgement and compensation. They were old by then, some in their 70s and 80s, but they refused to die without the truth being spoken. The Japanese government's response was cautious and cold. Officials admitted that medical experiments had been conducted, but avoided using the word atrocity. They expressed regret, but stopped short of apology. No compensation was offered, no prosecutions followed. It was the same denial wrapped in new words. Still, the survivors persisted. They brought photographs, diaries, and personal stories to court, They told judges about the planes that sprayed plague. They showed scars left by chemical burns. They named the doctors who had performed the experiments. Their courage turned the courtroom into a classroom of history. And for the first time, Japanese citizens sitting in the audience heard the truth from their own people. In the 1990s, pressure from abroad forced Japan to face its past more openly. Documentaries aired on television. Universities began teaching about Unit 731. Historians from Japan, China, and the West started collaborating to gather the remaining evidence. In 1993, Japan's then Prime Minister, Morihiro Hosokawa, acknowledged that the country had committed acts of aggression during the war, though he stopped short of naming Unit 731 directly. A few years later, Japan's health ministry admitted that some of its research facilities had employed former members of Ishii's team. And in 2002, a Tokyo court officially recognized, for the first time, that Unit 731 had indeed conducted human experiments. But the court still rejected compensation claims, arguing that the issue was settled by post-war treaties. The truth had finally been acknowledged, but justice had not. Today, the remains of Unit 731's facility still stand near Harbin, China. It has been turned into a museum. The Unit 731 exhibition hall. Inside, behind glass, visitors can see the instruments of death that once served science. Autopsy tables, glass jars, surgical tools, and photographs recovered from Japanese archives, faces of prisoners, doctors, and experiments frozen in time. The halls are silent, not because the past is forgotten, but because there are no words strong enough to contain it. Visitors walk slowly, reading the descriptions written on black plaques: test subject, frostbite experiment, plague infection study, and finally, evidence preserved for the truth. The museum stands not as vengeance, but as warning, a reminder of what happens when science loses its soul. Even now, controversy lingers. Japanese textbooks still debate how much should be taught about Unit 731. Some downplay it, others omit it entirely. And yet, in an age of global access, silence is no longer possible. The archives are open, the photographs exist, the testimonies have been recorded. The story that Japan once tried to erase has become part of world history, permanent, undeniable, and unforgettable. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story is not what happened, but what was allowed to happen. It reminds the world that the line between science and atrocity is thin. That knowledge without ethics is not progress, but destruction. That nations, when driven by fear or ambition, will trade morality for advantage, again and again. The victims of Unit 731 never saw justice, but their suffering became a warning to all humanity, a warning that echoes still. What begins as research in the name of security can end as horror in the name of science. History often buries its nightmares in silence, but silence does not erase them. It only delays their return. What happened inside Unit 731 was not an accident of war. It was the logical end of a belief that the pursuit of progress excuses any cost. That science, when serving the state, is beyond morality. It is a lesson humanity has been forced to learn again and again, and it began in a place where medicine forgot mercy. When the doors of Unit 731 closed forever in 1945, the world inherited its legacy, not through justice, but through knowledge. The data gathered through pain and death was locked away in classified archives, studied by military scientists, and later used to shape the rules that govern research today. The horror of Unit 731 became the silent foundation of modern bioethics. It forced the world to ask, where is the line between science and sin, and who draws it? After the war, as the full scale of Nazi medical crimes came to light, the Allies established the Nuremberg Code in 1947, a set of principles declaring that no experiment should ever be conducted on a human being without consent. It was humanity's first attempt to put morality into science. But what few people knew then was that the same crimes had occurred not only in Europe, but in Asia, under the rising sun. The difference was that those responsible in Japan were never tried. Their data became part of the scientific record, quietly influencing research while their names faded into obscurity. In the West, the moral reckoning came quickly. In Japan, it came slowly and painfully. By the 1970s, as Japan's economy soared, a new generation of scientists and doctors began to confront the shadow of their predecessors. Medical schools introduced ethics courses. Institutions that had once harbored Unit 731 veterans began quietly acknowledging their past. Some professors even resigned when confronted with their wartime roles. It was not redemption, but it was recognition. And recognition is where healing begins. In 1997, the World Medical Association formally reaffirmed the Nuremberg Principles through the Declaration of Helsinki, expanding the definition of medical ethics to include human dignity and international oversight. It was a direct response to decades of unethical experimentation, from Nazi Germany to Imperial Japan. The ghosts of Unit 731 had shaped the moral laws of modern medicine, but their influence did not end there. In laboratories and universities around the world, researchers studying pandemics and bioweapons often find themselves walking the same razor's edge between discovery and destruction. The story of Unit 731 is taught not only as history, but as warning, because the danger that created it still exists, not in ideology, but in ambition. The pursuit of knowledge is infinite, but when it loses compassion, it becomes tyranny disguised as science. Every generation faces that choice again, to remember or to repeat. In China, the memory of Unit 731 remains alive. Every year, survivors and their descendants gather at the Harbin Memorial to lay flowers and light candles. The museum stands quiet under the winter sky, surrounded by the same cold plains where the facility once operated. Visitors walk through rooms filled with glass cases and photographs, not to seek vengeance, but to understand. On one wall, written in Chinese and Japanese, are the words, "Let history be a mirror, and let humanity choose compassion." It is both an epitaph and a promise. In Japan, the story remains more complicated. Some deny, some apologize, most simply wish to move on. But history does not move on without truth. A few brave teachers still bring students to the memorial. They speak of what was done in their country's name, not to shame, but to teach. They remind them that silence is not peace, it is permission. The lesson of Unit 731 is not confined to one nation, it belongs to all of humanity. Because what happened there was not Japanese, it was human, and anything human can happen again. The scientists of Unit 731 called themselves doctors. They said they worked for progress. They believed they were serving their nation, and yet, in their laboratories, they destroyed everything that defines civilization, empathy, dignity, and the sanctity of life. That is the final horror of Unit 731. Not only what they did, but why they believed it was right. It shows us that the line between civilization and barbarism is not drawn by technology, but by conscience. It reminds us that Every time science is separated from morality, humanity pays the price. Decades after the last survivor of Unit 731 passed away, their story remains a whisper in the conscience of the modern world. Every ethical review board, every medical oath, every research regulation, they all exist because once, in a frozen corner of Manchuria, those boundaries were broken. The victims had no graves. Their names were erased. But their suffering forced humanity to build a system that values consent, dignity, and compassion. A fragile wall between progress and horror. And that wall must never fall again. When you walk through the ruins of Unit 731 today, you hear nothing. The wind moves through cracked walls and rusted metal. Snow gathers where once stood laboratories of death. Time has covered the blood, but not the guilt. Each step echoes like a question. How far would we go in the name of discovery? And how much of ourselves would we lose along the way? The past cannot be changed, but it can be remembered. And remembrance is resistance against denial, against repetition, against the temptation to believe that some lives matter less than others. The story of Unit 731 is not only a chronicle of cruelty, it is a warning written in history's darkest ink, a reminder that progress without conscience is just another form of destruction. This was the unknown zone, where history hides its darkest secrets, and where truth, no matter how buried, always returns to light. Because only by facing the shadows can humanity ever hope to stay in the light.